So glad to be able to speak to you today. My name is Jeff, and pastor the Constantia, the People's Church in Constantia. It's an Assembly of God church. Constantia is a beautiful area of Cape Town. If you're ever in the area, I invite you to come and pay us a visit. This morning we're doing something, we are changing the routine, we are changing our style, and we're going to be flighting a documentary put out by Africa Enterprise about the state of South Africa. And it's something that we believe everybody must hear. This film and this call to prayer by Michael Cassidy needs the widest possible audience. So listen with us, watch, and it's not a case of enjoy. Be challenged, be stirred, and let your faith rise. We will end with a time of prayer. God bless you, and thank you for being with us today.
Almost no tribe or nation in the world can claim that they are innocent of causing war or injustice at some point in history. And two common denominators causing these wars are the fear of being dominated and the desire to dominate. It has been said that fear makes enemies of people who should be friends. These fears have caused countless civil wars in the past and present, not to mention long-standing wars between various nations and cultural groups.
The question is, are there solutions to these problems? We believe the answer is yes, and they can be found in South Africa's own more recent history. So we'd like to take you back to the early 1990s, when millions of people were gearing up for civil war in South Africa. Two of the best negotiators in the world, Lord Carrington and Dr. Henry Kissinger, along with a number of other significant world figures, were called in. But they abandoned the peace talks and left the country, fearing a South African Armageddon. A miracle was needed to avoid civil war. There were numerous people who played a major role during that time, and many paid a heavy price for their part in the struggle. For the sake of our program, we feature a few key leaders relevant to this specific story.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
I entered my presidency with a vision of one united South Africa, of the recognition of our diversity while also building the unity of our nation.
I remember we used to shout, freedom in our lifetime. But when we were sleeping in bed, you wondered, in fact, whether that would happen.
If God be for us, who can be against us?
Because I feel that we have achieved something in this country where those who have oppressed us in the past are actually talking to us.
If we look dispassionately at our experiences of the 1994 election, that, I believe, was nothing less than a miracle.
We didn't know whether ultimately there's going to be a war within the country.
That what had happened in the country had been wrong, just totally wrong. And it was time for that to be rectified.
We don't like God, at least let us all do it for the common good.
A miracle is a temporary suspension of the laws of nature. It's when something unnatural happens.
Ek wil daai mense vra om my te help. Ekskuus dan wil ek huil.
If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and turn away from their wicked ways.
Then the promise is, I will heal their land.
And that prayer and that humbling and that repentance is a spiritual side required of man and of God's people. And then he says he will do his part. And I think that's what we saw in 94. And that's why I think in South Africa now, prayer is so important.
In order to start, we need to have some understanding of how the system called apartheid came about. It all began centuries ago when the southernmost parts of Africa were only inhabited by the Khoikhoi and the Khoisan people.
Centuries later, African tribes from the north migrated to southern Africa. The Nguni peoples, including the Zulu, Xhosa, Swazi and Ndebele, preferred to live near the eastern coast. The Tswana, Pedi and Sotho settled on the Highveld, while the Venda, Lemba and Tsonga peoples made their homes in the northeastern areas.
In 1652, Dutch settlers that included some Germans made their way to the Cape in order to provide fresh produce to their merchant ships en route to the east, and they bought land from the Khoi king in 1672 after a Dutch-Khoi agreement was signed. These settlers were joined in 1687 by groups of French Huguenots who had to flee their homeland for their religious beliefs. And soon the first white nation in Africa was born that would later become the Afrikaner or Boer, a proud nation influenced to a large degree by Calvinistic and often strong Old Testament theology. In 1795, the British took control of the Cape Colony, and in 1820, more British settlers landed in Port Elizabeth, causing increased tensions between the Boers and the Brits.
Between 1800 and 1840, the Zulu clan of the Nguni, under the successive leadership of Dingiswayo, Shaka, and Dingane, developed a highly trained regiment and new fighting tactics that enabled the Zulus to establish a powerful kingdom north of the Tugela River. Shaka launched devastating military campaigns south of the Tugela River that disrupted and destroyed the peoples in that area, who were mainly Xhosa. This meant that the Xhosas moved further away from the Zulus and closer to the Boers and British settlers in the eastern parts of the Cape Colony. The result was 100 years of wars between the Boers and Xhosas that mainly centered around land issues and cattle theft. In 1824, the British had established a trading post at Port Natal, now Durban, and that same year they signed a treaty with Shaka, ceding them Port Natal and about 80 kilometers of coastline to a depth of 160 kilometers inland.
Eventually, the Boers lost all faith in the British justice system, especially in the way the British dealt with the conflict between the Boers and the Xhosas. This was the catalyst for Piet Retief's manifesto and led many of the Boers to move away from the Cape in what became known as the Great Trek. As they moved north, however, clashes between the Boers and the various African tribes followed, as negotiations for land were met with mistrust. Some Boers settled south of the Vaal River in what would become the Republic of the Orange Free State, while others moved further north to form the Transvaal Republic. For the sake of our story, we focus more on Natal, where Boers under Piet Retief arrived in 1838 and came face to face with the new Zulu king Dingaan. Dingaan became king in 1828 after assassinating his half-brother Shaka.
Retief wanted to buy land, and Dingane promised large areas to Retief if he would retrieve some stolen cattle for him. Retief understood this to be a purchase of the land, whereas Dingane understood it to be usufruct. Retief's efficiency in retrieving all the cattle alarmed Dingane, and he became insecure about the Boers' intent, so he devised a plan to eliminate them. After signing the purchase agreement, Dingane invited Retief and 70 followers into his kraal to celebrate in a feast, but instead he massacred the whole lot. Dingane then ordered his warriors to kill the rest of the Boers, which included another 538 men, women, and children.
The remaining group of Boers made an alliance with Prince Mapande, who also had a claim to the Zulu throne and who wanted to replace Dingaan. Together they began to devise a plan to attack Dingaan's stronghold, but before any action was taken, Dingaan stormed the Boers with some 20,000 warriors in the Battle of Blood River on 16 December 1838. The 470 Boer men, women and children with their modern weaponry defeated Dingaan's army in what they saw as a miraculous victory in answer to their prayer.
A few months later, Prince Mpande dethroned Dingane and became the new Zulu king. Mpande honored the agreement that was signed between Dingane and Retief, and it was agreed that the Boers could live south of the Tugela River. Thus, the Republic of Natalia was formed.
However, the British annexed the Republic of Natalia in 1843 and it became part of the Cape Colony. So most of the anguished Boers now moved to the Orange Free State and Transvaal. Over and above these two republics, there were also tribal kingdoms such as, amongst others, that of the Sotho, Tswana, Nama, and Swazis. The Zulus remained independent until 1879, when the British defeated them in the Zulu War, and now the Zulu kingdom became part of Natal.
Diamonds were discovered in 1867 and gold in 1886 in the Orange Free State and Transvaal areas. And not surprisingly, the long arm of British imperialism soon reached out for the diamonds and gold, and this led to the Anglo-Boer War. The Boer War lasted for 3 years and eventually ended after some 28,000 Boer women and children had died in British concentration camps. And the British troops burnt down most of the Boer homes and farms in their scorched earth tactics. Yet again, the Boers lost their independence, and this time they were impoverished and humiliated.
The Anglo-Boer War left a legacy of bitterness amongst the Boers, now more commonly known as Afrikaners. Under British rule, the Afrikaners were forbidden to speak their own language in schools and some other social places, and it took many years for the Afrikaners to work themselves out of the poverty.
South Africa was thus filled with 12 African tribes and one white nation, but none of them able to govern themselves. Proud tribal kings were left with little or no rights. This was an explosive situation.
But leaders among both Boers and Britons began to craft the beginnings of self-government for South Africa. This culminated in the Act of Union in 1910, whereby Britain granted some form of self-governance to white South Africans to rule over a unified country that brought together the Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal, and Orange Free State. Thus, the Afrikaners and English-speaking white South Africans became one nation, even though tensions between the two cultures remained for many decades. Sadly, the African tribes were left to fend for themselves, with their political rights ignored, thereby drawing the black people inevitably into conflict with white people. Thus, in 1912, the African National Congress, or ANC, was founded to look after black interests, and in 1914, the National Party to look after Afrikaner interests. This National Party, nurtured by the spiritual and rebuilding influence of the Dutch Reformed Church, began to develop the resolution that the Afrikaners would rise and throw off every yoke, particularly the British one, and never again allow themselves to come under the heel of any other nation. Afrikaner politicians like Dr. D.F. Malan and Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd and Dutch Reformed theologians picked up from the Dutch Prime Minister and theologian Abraham Kuyper the notion of God dealing as much with peoples and nations as individuals.
In the 1940s, black urbanization and population explosion accelerated, which led to a mounting Afrikaner fear of what they called the swart gevaar, or the black danger, of being swamped and overrun. This birthed the idea of separate states and the politics of separateness, called apartheid. In 1948, Dr. D.F. Malan and the National Party, under the apartheid banner, defeated the more liberal General Smuts' United Party in a momentous election. And in 1951, 10 separate states, or Bantustans, were established in South Africa for the purpose of giving self-governance to each tribe. The ideology being that white people would be citizens of South Africa, while black people would become citizens of their own tribal nation. By now, there were also a large number of so-called colored people who were formed from mixed marriages and freed slaves, as well as the original Khoi and Khoisan, a group of Indian people who arrived in South Africa in 1860 and settled in the Natal area. This complicated the separation laws even further.
Verwoerd put the essential finishing touch to it by saying that apartheid is the means by which you allow the black man to have everything that the white man has, only in his own area. He actually put apartheid forward as being not an illiberal policy, but a policy of social engineering that would at the end of the day bring justice to everybody through separation.
But the apartheid ideology was deeply flawed. The biggest flaw was breaking down the human dignity of people groups who were classified as non-white.
What was the worst thing about apartheid?
Ultimately, it's actually when it makes you doubt that you are a child of God. When you are subjected to treatment that begins to work in here, and you begin to say, hey, maybe they are right. Language is very powerful. Language does not just describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. And so when we call you a non-European, a non-this, you might think it isn't working on you, but in fact, it is corrosive of your self-image. You end up wondering whether you are actually as human as those others.
The apartheid laws became stricter, including that white and black people could not intermarry. They could also not share ablution facilities, public recreation facilities, or public transport. And black and white children were forced to go to different schools, receiving different levels of education opportunities.
And so the Afrikaner who used to be oppressed became the oppressor, and in an effort to preserve their own culture, put in place a system called apartheid. Huge resistance and peaceful protests built up from the leaders of the African National Congress, such as Albert Luthuli, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela, as well as from the Pan-Africanist Congress, led by Robert Sobukwe. During a large protest in Sharpeville in 1959, police killed 69 unarmed demonstrators, where after the ANC and PAC were banned. At this point, the ANC turned to sabotage and guerrilla warfare in their fight against apartheid.
Friday, May 20th, 1983. At 4:30 p.m., the African National Congress detonate a 50-kilogram car bomb in a crowded Pretoria street, catching hundreds of people in a barrage of flying glass and debris. Eyewitness reports reveal the horror at the scene of this naked terror.
Dismembered bodies and maimed and dying people lay scattered along the pavement, in shops and in the street. I saw people on fire and others literally flung through the air.
In this, South Africa's worst onslaught of urban terrorism, 19 people are killed and 217 injured and maimed. In retaliation to this outrage, the South African government reacts in the only way that it knows how, with the mailed fist. 3 days later, on Monday the 23rd of May, an estimated 10 South African Air Force Impalas, armed with missiles and cannons, devastate 6 targets 14 kilometers west of Maputo, reportedly killing 64 African National Congress exiles and 6 civilians.
And in 1964, Mandela and others were sentenced to life imprisonment on charges of treason and branded as terrorists. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, where he spent 18 of his 27 years in prison. Not long after his imprisonment, Mandela became the focus of a worldwide campaign to be freed. Major internal opposition also came from the United Democratic Front, led by Alan Boesak, the Progressive Party with Helen Suzman as its lone parliamentary voice, and from many church leaders such as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Dennis Hurley, Cardinal Wilfred Napier, and Reverend Frank Chikane.
There are only 2 ways to freedom in South Africa. The one way is through sitting down and talking, which we say, let us do. The other, and there is no middle way. All this is nonsense. I've got middle way. There are only 2 options. We either talk or we fight. If you think you can stop us from becoming free, you are going to be stampeded.
By the late 1980s, things began to change, and the National Party, under enormous opposition and pressure, began to think of abolishing apartheid. One of the many people deeply involved within South Africa in facilitating change was Michael Cassidy, founder and leader of African Enterprise, whose lesser-known story we are focusing on in this presentation.
I believe Jesus loves Africa.
The context it's been my privilege or lot to engage has really been the world of apartheid from the time I was a schoolboy through being a university student, picketing South Africa House and all kinds of things when I was a student in England, and then on into ministry and all the difficulties of trying to witness within the extreme difficulties of the apartheid dispensation. But we were trying to engage the context while we carried out the mission of African Enterprise, which is to evangelize the cities of Africa through word and deed in partnership with the church. That was our first aim and calling. They were difficult years, as I've indicated, because they were the apartheid years. We found ourselves in interface with this system and realize that not only does the gospel command us to have a personal witness of bringing people to Christ and to love people, but that it has a demand of justice, which to me is love built into structures, and that you cannot see injustice around you and continue faithfully to profess the way of love of our Lord Jesus Christ.
And they come back, and there are two reports. There's a majority report of 10 and a minority report of 2 from Caleb and Joshua. And the majority report said, we can't go. They said the problems are too great. They said the giants, the people there are too big, they're giants, they're too large, and the cities have walls that are too high. And we felt like grasshoppers in our own sight and grasshoppers in their sight, we can't go. Caleb and Joshua, on the other hand, said, if the Lord God our God delights in us, if the Lord our God delights in us, we can go, and he will be with us. And they looked at the problems with the eyes of faith, and the eyes of God, not just taking their cue from the situation and from the problematic. And the Spirit of God spoke to my heart at that time and said, are you with the 10 or are you with the 2? And I had to say, Lord, at this point in time, I'm with the 10. And the Spirit of God spoke to my heart and said, move over now and get with the 2. And move to the place of faith. And I moved then to the place of faith with the 2, to look at the problems with a divine perspective. And I've never moved back to the 10. I've stayed with the 2. And I'd no sooner moved over to the 2 than I was freed of my depression and began to feel, yes, we should convene the South African church.
Whatever one might say about that old apartheid crew of people in Verwoerd's government and ones that followed, they were all basically churchgoers. They were all, again, professing Christians. They would have all been in church on Sundays.
But Christianity is not only the white man's religion. Many of the oppressed worshipped the same God.
And I had just become a Christian. And so throughout my Christian journey, I was wrestling with the role faith was playing in our society. And the idea that I believed that I could best make a contribution in this country as an engineer, but for some reason I was barred from being an engineer because of the policies of apartheid at the time. And so it stayed with me. Why is it? Where is God in this? And how is it that the people who were helping to disciple me or strengthen, develop me into the Christian faith, actually supported apartheid. And I remember the first Bible I received after deciding I wanted to be a Christian was given to me by a white person. And again came face to face with what it meant to have very good Christians who believed apartheid was right. And I believed it was wrong, and we couldn't agree. Fast forward, 1979, I went to a conference that was hosted by Michael Cassidy. Incidentally, it was called Sattler. And for the first time, I was exposed to a conference that brought together faith, in other words, the born-again variety of faith, that faith, which is normally very conservative, very otherworldly, very pietistic, but bringing that together with a social concern, social justice issues, and integrating it, and figuring out how you do this, how you hold together the faith in God and a concern for justice.
The South African Christian Leadership Assembly, in short SACLA, was initiated by Michael Cassidy and the Afrikaans theologian David Bosch to discover together what it means to be witnesses of Christ as Saviour and Lord in South Africa today. Some 5,000 Christian leaders attended.
SACLA was an astonishing thing, and it set up a network of relationships all across South Africa. Nothing could stop it. Nothing could hold it back. It was like the sluice gates were opening even more.
Each one of us had a role to play. Some of the immediate results of that conference were initiatives for people to visit one another across the various boundaries that were keeping us away from one another.
It became a wake-up call to the church's social responsibility insofar as the political era at that time. So it woke all of us up, as I think as a church and as individuals, to what responsibility we have to the social structure and circumstance in our country. That's what SACLA did in '79.
Michael also initiated and/or participated in leadership in a succession of other watershed conferences and prayer initiatives between the 1960s and 1994.
One of the people deeply affected by SACLA was a man called Johann Haynes, Professor Johann Haynes. He was a lovely man. Johann Haynes, after SACLA, said, we have got to pause and have a look at this thing again. And he appointed a commission to sit and to explore, could the Bible theologically legitimize apartheid or not? And Haynes's commission went to work, and he came pretty much just after SACLA. He became moderator of the Dutch Reformed Church. And then in 1985 came the tumultuously important synod of the Dutch Reformed Church. And they reported their findings coming out of the commission. The verdict was, apartheid is a sin. 4 words. But no more revolutionary words in terms of the Afrikaner world and the Dutch Reformed Church world could have come forth, because it immediately put the theological skids under the government. Now, even Verwoerd in his time had said, if the Dutch Reformed Church ever says the Bible doesn't allow for or justify apartheid, he said apartheid will fall.
This huge experiment called apartheid has turned out to be a failure.
On Saturday evening, 5 November 1994, Haynes was playing cards with his wife and 3 grandchildren, then aged 2, 8, and 11, at his home in Pretoria. He died instantly when an assassin using a .303 caliber rifle delivered a single gunshot through a window. The bullet entered at the back of his neck and left near his eye, leaving a wound as big as a man's fist. The assassin was never found, but there was no doubt Dr. Haynes paid with his life for his beliefs.
The moral case was being questioned by the leaders who created it in the first place. Sanctions increased, protests overflowed the country, and the seeds of negotiation were planted. The regime was starting to unravel at its core.
He said that we must get together to negotiate. So we insisted that we're prepared to negotiate, but the non-negotiable is that Mr. Mandela and those who are in prison from all political parties and those who are in exile must return, so that we should all be involved in mapping out the future.
I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison on Sunday, the 11th of February, at about 3 p.m. I call upon Mr. Mandela and all other interested parties to make their contribution towards a positive climate for negotiations.
This day brought inner hope the country had never before experienced.
A free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
After 27 years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela, as well as other political prisoners, were released and exiles allowed to return home. But instead of coming home with hate, they had hope at heart. Hope of a South Africa that is fair, just and right. Together, change was imminent. But first, all the parties had to come to the table to negotiate the transition.
So the bigger parties included Mandela heading the African National Congress, Buthelezi heading the Inkatha Freedom Party, representing the Zulu state, Clarence Makwetu leading the Pan-Africanist Congress, Zak de Beer leading the Democratic Party, Constant Viljoen leading the Freedom Front, F.W. de Klerk heading the National Party, Kenneth Mesre leading the African Christian Democratic Party, and Chris Hani leading the Communist Party. 11 other parties also registered for the election.
With all the role players in place to partake in changing the fundamental constructs of our country towards an inclusive democratic election, we were all about to witness the biggest show on earth. But the long history of tribal violence in South Africa soon began to threaten the idea of a peaceful and fair election. The IFP, short for Inkatha Freedom Party, was founded by Prince Buthelezi, who also happened to be the great-grandson of King Cetshwayo Kampani, and they represented the Zulus. The Zulus seemed skeptical about a Xhosa-dominated ANC and demanded some kind of self-governance for their Zulu king. Violent clashes between the IFP and the armed wing of the ANC, known as Umkhonto weSizwe, or MK, became more and more common. MK was co-founded in 1961 by Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu in the wake of the Sharpeville massacre. Its mission was to fight against the South African government. Local action by MK included a series of bombings throughout South Africa, whereby many civilians were killed. MK foreign action included countries like Namibia, Angola, and Zimbabwe, and they had a strong alliance with Russia and Cuba. In the early 90s, the Chief of Staff was Chris Hani, who was also the leader of the South African Communist Party. Hani received his training in the Soviet Union and was a fierce military leader, respected by many.
Civil war threats did not only arise between black tribes, but also came from certain white groups. President de Klerk and his government were strongly criticized by right-wing leaders who saw him as a traitor. The most powerful leader being former Chief of the South African Defence Force, General Constant Viljoen. He had a force of 60,000 trained paramilitary personnel at his command. This force was assembled in preparation as a potential contingency to protect Afrikaner interests.
Well, already we have a problem of majoritarianism in South Africa, and we are confronted with a big problem which we've also experienced in the rest of Africa. And that is a power-hungry organization, and the dangers that South Africa's democracy might change into a one-party-dominated state.
General Viljoen maintained good control over his men and never used violence during the entire process. The same could not be said of other smaller but more radical groups like the AWB and their leader Eugene Ter Blanche. The AWB, short for Afrikaner Weerstandbeweging, was an ultra-right-wing group opposed to the idea of black and white people living together. They were willing to fight for self-governance. A violent altercation came the day they retaliated to the police, known as the Battle of Ventersdorp.
The attack first on the police who tried to disperse them, then spinning it over into a frenzy of racial hatred. In the chaos, at least 2 AWB members were shot dead and 2 black bus passengers were killed.
This was the first time that police had used lethal force against whites in South Africa, resulting in the death of several.
Is die AWB bereid om die dood tegemoet te gaan? Hulle kry nie ons land nie. Ons sal die ANC gelyk maak met wapengeweld in hierdie land
The ongoing political violence
After my speech on the 2nd of February 1990 and after the release of all political prisoners, not just Mr. Mandela, was a great disappointment to me. We expected some trouble, but not the amount of trouble that actually existed.
We had to smooth down the violence and get on to interaction.
Action had to be taken, and a written promise was made by all government officials, including Mandela, Buthelezi, and F.W. de Klerk, as they signed the peace accord in order to find a peaceful way to transition into an inclusive democracy by means of negotiating. Formal negotiations began at the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, known as CODESA 1, at the World Trade Center in Kempton Park. 19 political parties attended, excluding 2, the Conservative Party and the Pan-Africanist Congress, who boycotted the negotiations.
And we were very close to coming together to understand one another and to accept that South Africa will be governed by everybody here.
Which led to the place where greater understanding happened between these political leaders. One moment they didn't trust one another, the next they were willing to risk.
In order to proceed, de Klerk had to be sure that he had the support of the people. So the government called on all white South Africans to vote in a referendum whether or not they were for negotiations with black people and the fall of apartheid. For if the majority voted yes, the negotiations could continue peacefully.
White South Africans are flocking to the polls today in one of the country's most historic referendums, a referendum which will decide the future of South Africa. Voting began briskly in Pretoria this morning. Queues formed at all the polling booths before voting began at 7 o'clock. There was a lively atmosphere at a school in Arcadia, where President F.W. de Klerk and his wife Marika brought out their votes. A smiling Mr. de Klerk told the horde of international newsmen that he was optimistic about the result.
Reg is ja.
Is hy optimisties, meneer de Klerk?
Ek is optimisties. Ek dink dit sal goed gaan. Hier's wonderlike entoesiasme en ons kry terugvoering dat die mense vinnig stem, flink stem en entoesiasties stem.
The result was a clear majority yes, as 68% of the white people voted in favor of change. Negotiations could continue. This was significant because this time white South Africans willingly gave their self-governance away without a war, even though they knew that they would be outnumbered in the election. They gave this governance away in faith that the new South Africa under the leadership of the ANC would be a just and fair place where all the different cultural groups would be treated as equal.
Even though peaceful negotiations were underway, serious crimes escalated by a record-breaking 1,000%. CODESA started cracking at its foundations.
Everybody was saying there's failure. It wasn't going to work.
We didn't know whether ultimately there's going to be a war within the country or not.
On the night of 17th June, in the township of Boipatong, 45 ANC members died during an armed attack. Shortly after the massacre, it was claimed by members of the ANC that the South African police force, in cooperation with the Inkatha Freedom Party, had organized the raid, and Mandela withdrew the ANC from negotiations, ending CODESA. After the failed attempt of negotiations, an inclusive democracy began to look like nothing but a dream. With the fall of CODESA, what could possibly get this process back on track? A year later, and the promise of a new South Africa is nowhere in sight. The old government is still the ruling power, and no election date has been set. Was this all just a dream?
And part of what made apartheid survive as long as it did is that people didn't understand each other, didn't know each other, they just were enemies, scripted to fight each other.
I had a friend who was in the Progressive Party, Rupert Lorimer. He and I were talking around about different things, about dialogue and so forth, and he said, you know, why don't we try and get some of these guys away? And he said, I know a place called Kolobe, Lodge near Pretoria. Rupert and I thought, wouldn't it be just great if we could gather these guys together at Kolobe and have them share their stories and let the chemistry of that to its work. We created a place of comfort, upmarket facility, of fun, taking people on game drives and picnics, and so they could discover themselves in their common humanity. And people came together, and each one shared their autobiography. And some had hardly ever done this before. They were very intoxicated by doing it. They realized what compelling stories they actually had. So as they did, the scales fell off people's eyes. It was an amazing thing. They just listened, saw, and slowly the enemy became demythologized. We had the groups from far left to far right, senior people from government, from the Communist Party, from ANC, from Inkatha, Freedom Party, and some of the Afrikaner conservative groups, like the Afrikaner Volksunie, and black groups like AZAPO. Fear ruled the world, or ruled our worlds at that stage. So people were suspicious, and I think they wondered, really, what actually were they getting into? They knew it was going to be other people, and therefore there would be some enemies there. So some of those who came to Kolobe came with bodyguards, and one or two with AK-47s.
Michael Cassidy kom na my toe. Hy sê, maar kyk, ek praat nou onder korreksie, maar ek dink was die PAC se jong mense nou net daar opgedaag. En in die kattebak van hulle kar het hulle AK-47 of 2 gehad. Maar ons het dit maar stil gehou, en die naweek was so suksesvol dat hulle nie die AK nodig gehad het nie.
Then I remember one morning seeing it might have been in Kariming or one of the others, Communist Party and an Afrikaner Volksunie person swimming in a little pool together, just having fun, splashing each other, you know.
Ek onthou dat ek by een van die kampe het ek vir iemand uit my provinsie, ek kom van die Noordwes provinsie af, my habitat daar, Ruth Mompati daar ontmoet. En wat ek van haar gelees het voor die tyd was dat sy baie radikaal was, en daar het ek bevind. Sy is eintlik net so min radikaal as wat ek radikaal is.
One of the things that came out to me from everyone sharing their stories was that it seemed like everyone was wanting the same result for South Africa. It's only the methods that were different.
Op die Christelike grondslag besonder baie raakpunte is tussen Afrikaners en blankes en swart mense.
And they didn't all come out agreeing politically, but they all came out friends as against enemies, and they all came out with understanding, and they all came out with feeling, well, I've got access to that person.
I heard Chris's daughter Kwezi crying. I rushed out of the house, and then I saw her. She came to me running, and I went over the house, and I saw Chris. He was lying there, clutching a newspaper, and I think he was dead.
Chris has just been shot. Oh my God. I felt a big hole had opened, and all of those hopes and those aspirations about this new South Africa were just going to go into this black hole, and it was just going to be war.
At that stage, we knew that there were forces afoot which could cause major problems in the country in the run-up to the breakthroughs that we did constitutionally.
His killing, again, brought in a lot of shaking among us all, and it made the ANC feel quickly there must be elections as soon as possible.
Today, an unforgivable crime has been committed. The calculated, cold-blooded murder of Chris Hani is not just a crime against a dearly beloved son of our soil. It is a crime against all the people of our country. We are a nation in mourning. Our pain and anger is real, yet we must not permit ourselves to be provoked by those who seek to deny us the very freedom Chris Hani gave his life for. Let us respond with dignity in a disciplined fashion. The ANC dips its banner in salute to this outstanding son of Africa. Tsamaya hantle, hamba kahle, Comrade Chris.
And I can't accept people's calling for war. I mean, I don't accept what the PAC is saying about a year of great storms. Because I feel that we have achieved something in this country where those who have oppressed us in the past are actually talking to us and are showing readiness to negotiate for democratic elections.
And he began to insist that Chris can't have died in vain. Let's make a solemn promise that on the 27th April the following year, there will be an election here.
After Chris Hani's death, the ANC started pushing for the creation of a body that would ensure a level playing field in order to transition South Africa to a peaceful democracy.
Negotiations were back on as a transitional executive council was put in place to guide all the parties involved in negotiation. Yet, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Freedom Alliance, an alliance of right-wing, and the Inkatha Freedom Party were still not ready to come to the table.
Michael Cassidy and African Enterprise urgently called for another Kalobi weekend with second and third tier party leadership to help the process of dialogue, whilst the heads of most of the parties were meeting at the World Trade Center to discuss the election date. These peace talks were interrupted and almost completely derailed after the AWB stormed and invaded the World Trade Center during negotiations.
They look like they're invading the place.
And they have this idea that they can somehow or other overthrow the process that is moving forward, and that they can overthrow it violently.
The van came in and went through that glass, wow, breaking the glass, and we just all dispersed, all of us, and we didn't know. And then there was chaos then, that was an uncomfortable situation.
Even though there was resistance, it did not prevail.
The date was written in the blood of Chris Hani.
The elation for the election date was short-lived as the IFP decided to boycott the election. The concerns of the IFP were still based on a fear of being dominated by the ANC, who were strongly represented by Xhosas like Mandela. The Zulus suggested a federal government, similar to that of the USA, whereby the various provinces would have much more power over themselves. They wanted this so that the Zulu king would remain in power in KwaZulu-Natal, and the Zulus were willing to fight for this right. Many of the right-wing leaders agreed with the view of the Zulus because they also wanted separate states for each tribal and ethnic group, similar to the homeland system of apartheid.
So then my party decided that, well, in this case, because I wear another hat as traditional prime minister of the king, I said that if the king's position is not clear, I dare not, going to go on in negotiations. And that created a very serious problem because some people that thought this situation where there was so much bloodshed would be exacerbated, actually. Sadly, if I may say so, the ANC and the National Party had gone into a post parade into the bush where they agreed that any agreement between the two of them was sufficient consensus. That complicated matters. That is why those of us who were left out, then we started the Concerned South African group, COSAC. And amongst them, of course, there were some people who were very right-wing, General Viljoen and so on. But we're not actually embracing what they were doing. We're talking just about everyone should be, involved.
The Afrikaner and the Zulu people don't want to be dominated by the communists. We are slaves of nobody. We are all freemen, and our intention is to fight and to die for it.
A table needs all four legs to stand on. Without one, it will fall. That's our democracy. People were more confused than ever, and it escalated onto the streets. A number of horrific bombings took place in the name of the struggle against apartheid, killing innocent civilians. One of these bombings became known as the St. James Church Massacre in Cape Town, where 4 members of the Zanian People's Liberation Army, or APLA, entered the church during a worship service. They threw M26 hand grenades and opened fire with assault rifles, killing 11 and wounding 58 others. APLA was the military wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress, or PAC, and their slogan was, "One settler, one bullet."
To walk into that chaos that night was a very shocking experience for me personally, as well as obviously for the congregation. And immediately the media came around and asked me why were our people offering forgiveness and reconciliation. Well, it had a very huge impact in so many different ways. For instance, in the country, in the build-up to the elections, there has been a tremendous amount of war talk, a lot of cries for vengeance and revenge and a lot of hate talk and things like that. And now suddenly, here's a church that is put through this kind of experience. And instead of war talk, there is this entirely different kind of language coming from the church, the language of forgiveness and the language of love and the language of Christ-likeness. And it had a profound impact. Many people were so bewildered by it that they got angry, people outside of the church. But the impact for the gospel was unbelievable. It actually turned out to be the greatest evangelistic event in the history of this country, as far as I'm concerned.
Then I knew both my sons were dead, and then after the funeral, I made a commitment to the Lord, and the Lord has given me so much grace that I honestly and truly forgive those people that did this to him.
African Enterprise continued to host Kolobe encounters in an effort to bring peace. In total, 92 senior political leaders went through the 6 Kolobe encounters, and a network of new friendships were formed that included people like Frank Mdalozi, Dani Skitter, Andries Beyers, and Johan Steenkamp. One of the many significant outcomes from the Kolobe encounters happened when the PAC expressed feelings of shame about the bombings. The PAC asked Michael Cassidy to assist their organization to reform their values. Michael agreed on condition that they never use their slogan of "One settler, one bullet" ever again. They agreed.
There was a lot of violence in this country, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of what was then called black-on-black violence. All of this pushed us to a place where negotiation became inevitable. But even when that was set on course, there were still possibilities of a hijack.
From May to November that year, more than 800 people died in the political violence, adding high stakes for leadership to come together and come to consensus before civil war could erupt.
Question to Mr. de Klerk. Mr. de Klerk, violence, both political and criminal, poses a #1 threat to the elections, and over the past few years it has continued unabated, and seemingly the government is unable to deal with it. With that kind of record, as still incumbent president, what guarantees do you give the electorate tonight that violence will not get completely out of hand and thus subvert the forthcoming elections?
Thank you for the question, Tim. Let me start out by saying I disagree with the analysis that the government is not dealing effectively with it. Yes, there is too much violence, but the government has taken extensive steps to deal with it. The government is taking whatever steps is possible, but its task has been made very difficult by inter alia, our main opponent, the ANC, by their demonizing of the police force, by driving a wedge between communities and the police force. Our task has been made extremely difficult. I sit here with 8 extracts from Goldstone reports showing that the violence in all 8 instances, and they were serious instances, in all 8 instances was attributed to ANC supporters and Inkatha supporters at each other's throats. That is not an easy problem to solve.
Any leader who is merely promoting the point of view of his political party is not a leader who is going to help her to pull out South Africa from this mess. And what I find unacceptable is the fact that the president should misquote the reports of Mr. Goldstone. Because if you look at his report, the police are deeply involved in this violence. You have one of the top police officers who has been suspended from his duty precisely because there are serious allegations against him of gun running, of working with murderers to murder innocent people. I have discussed these issues with Mr. de Klerk on a one-on-one basis confidentially, provided him with evidence of the activities of his police. There is one thing he does not want to know. There is one thing that he covers very, very stubbornly, and that is the involvement of senior police officials in this violence. That is the truth. That is the total picture.
I think in an unbalanced way, the security forces are blamed for that ongoing violence. Yes, they played a role. Yes, I had to take very firm steps. Yes, the Goldstone Commission did open a can of worms, which motivated me to take some strong action.
They set up a meeting to discuss the ongoing violence and how to get all parties involved in the election. But after 10 long hours, there was no avail, and the violence kept escalating. Word also spread that the AWB were training the IFP and supplying them with arms. This proved to be untrue.
Liars are saying that, but no, there was nothing like that. In fact, the ANC, even Ms. Mandela is the founder of MK, and he's celebrated as the founder of MK. I was invited by Mr. Tambo to actually endorse the armed struggle, and I did not. And I suffered vilification and even threats to my life because they wanted me to take up arms, and I refused to take up arms.
With the IFP and others boycotting the election, more than 10,000 deaths and counting, and only 4 months left until the election, South Africa was more separate than ever.
It was agreed that there will be international mediation on the issue of the monarchy.
The main issue remained that all the parties could not collectively agree on what would be the new constitution of the country.
So on March 1st, 1994, Mandela and Buthelezi agreed that they would settle their differences if international mediators would get involved to help negotiate the place of the monarchy of the Zulu king within the new constitution of South Africa. It was agreed, and in just a few days, the former US Secretary of State, Dr. Kissinger, and former British Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, would head a team of international mediators who would shortly be arriving in South Africa. However, the public was unaware of the possible mediation, and 20,000 Zulus decided to take their protests to the streets.
Duisende Zulus het vanoggend in Johannesburg se middestad bymekaar gekom om hulle steun aan die Zulu koning te betuig. Maar 'n optog wat vreedsaam begin het nie so geëindig nie. En toe die optog verby die ANC hoofkwartier in Shell House beweeg, is die eerste skote gehoor. Een persoon is in die kruisvuur geskiet. Die eerste skoot het vermoedelik uit omliggende geboue gekom. Voetgangers het rondgeskarrel en verskuiling gesoek, maar woedende Zulus het beweer die ANC het op hulle geskiet.
The Zulu nation is demanding his Zulu sovereign state, but ANC they shoot us in the flag. That one is very, very, very wrong. We are angry about it.
That march actually was done mostly by Zulus in the hostels concerning the place of the monarchy. It was not an Inkatha march. I mean, I didn't participate in it, for instance. It's not true that the people attacked the ANC office. They just passed by, going to the library where they're going to hold their protests, and then they were shot at.
Mandela, we got to learn afterwards, was really supportive of those ANC people that we say, well, look, if the IFP attacks you, You better just kill them and shoot them down and all.
It was he who ordered that they should shoot to kill.
Despite the violence, the mediators were on their way to start the talks, but there were some concerns that there were no African mediators.
And Frank Mdlaloza showed me the original list. And I said, Frank, you know, you haven't got a significant African even in there. There were judges from Canada and Australia and goodness only knows where. And I said, I want to recommend Washington Okumu. And he was an economist and diplomat from Kenya that I had got to know through friends in England. And it seemed to us that he could be useful in South Africa. So we took the initiative of asking him if he would come and meet some of our players. He already knew Kissinger, under whom he'd studied at Harvard. He knew Buthelezi, he knew Mandela, he had even known John Forster. And we said to Mr. Kissinger, Dr. Kissinger, we're praying for you, for an outcome of this. And I forget exactly what he said. He looked a bit startled at the notion of prayer coming into politics.
With Professor Okumu joining the mediation process, discussions took off.
But only one day later, the mediation process collapsed, and Lord Carrington and Dr. Kissinger took the first flight home in fears of civil war breaking out. All hope seemed lost.
I heard from him 24 hours later, and he said, Michael, the whole thing's collapsed. He said, it's completely fallen through.
And he gave up, and his comments was, there is no hope.
Washington said that Kissinger was going home and had announced that Armageddon would be here in South Africa in 2 weeks' time. He said Lord Carrington, the British Foreign Secretary, or former Foreign Secretary, was also going home. They were all going home. And he said, and I'm going home.
They had to pack their bags and leave.
And I was brave enough or foolish enough or daring enough to say, no, Washington, you can't go. You're the one person who can't go. So he stayed on at the hotel in Johannesburg. And then first thing in the morning, he said, I've got to see Buthelezi. Well, they found out Buthelezi had already left to go back to Natal and had gone out to Lanseria Airport. And he was going to go back to the king and say to the king, look, it's all over. We must gear up for major showdown. Kumu just took wings. He got in a car and he raced out in a taxi to Lanseria Airport to try and catch Buthelezi and talk to him.
When I got to the Lanseria Airport, I was told that Professor Okumu asked me to wait for him. So I said, well, I had to leave because he hasn't come.
He got to the airport only to find that the plane had taken off. But almost simultaneously, they heard, no, the plane is coming back.
But something very strange happened. As we were airborne, we were suddenly told that there was something wrong with the plane, you know. I was surprised because the plane was fairly new too.
They found that the compass was gyrating violently, and it wasn't life-threatening, but aviation laws don't allow you to fly if your compass is not functioning properly.
So we had to go back to Lanseria, and there was this man. This man was as big as life. He was a huge chap. There he was having a cup of tea. He then said to me, look, he wanted to do something about this Apartheid international mediation, if I don't mind. He wants to get my consent. He would approach President de Klerk, he would approach Mr. Mandela and talk to them whether he cannot be reinstated. Because he said he feared that if we stayed out of the election, the problem of violence might be worse. So I said I didn't mind.
Interestingly, the ground crew at Lanseria were puzzled and said there was in fact nothing wrong with the compass. They had no idea why it had gyrated during the flight. This was seen, even by the pilot, as a significant miracle. Professor Okumu drafted an agreement which the politicians would discuss the following day at the Jesus Peace Rally, a prayer gathering put in place by Michael Cassidy and African Enterprise to call for peace. The agreement would entail pursuing international mediation once again after the election was over to decide whether South Africa would have a unitary or a federal constitution, with the Zulu state still having some measure of autonomy. The face of this election finally changed to a glimmer of hope.
People like Lord Carrington and Henry Kissinger were very, very doubtful that we could achieve peace here. So that inspired us really to go ahead for it. And now that we had a date that was really appropriate, we were able to really get this rally going.
We didn't know whether people would come. It was very dangerous, it was very heated. And the day before was meant to be a match at Kings Park Stadium. And they cancelled the match for that Saturday because they said it's too dangerous to gather people together. So we said, well, that's their problem. We are going to meet together. So it was very nice because the stadium was clean and you didn't have to do all the post-rugby crowd tidying up. And the day dawned of the prayer meeting.
In the main rugby stadium of Durban, the Christian churches of Natal had come together to pray for peace.
It was a faith venture. And when you put your trust in God, we're not doing just working alone, but we also know that we are co-laborers together with God. So we are dependent on that, and God really was working on our behalf because he had his own plans for this country. And then we had an evangelist from Africa Enterprise by the name of Abel Tapiane, and he opened in prayer. But he did something that was remarkable when he asked all those people who had lost loved ones in the violence to please stand. And when we saw all these people stand, there was such an outpouring of emotions that we were all able to stand together with them. And for the first time, we found such a unity amongst the believers. We were not concerned about color. We saw ourselves as believers and followers of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, that it caused us to hug each other and to hold each other's hands and to begin to pray. There were tears that were flowing that I'd never seen before with such a big rally. I remember as well, as soon as that was finished, we started to really worship God. This was also spontaneous, and this is what made such a big difference at that rally. Everyone was just working together with God, to achieve God's plan and his purposes for this country.
You get to the stage, well, what can we do other than pray? There's nothing we can do other than pray to help this process. Well, the main impact was what was happening behind the scenes. Those people weren't even taking part in the prayer rally. They were discussing in the little ante-rooms off the VIP lounge about this whole settlement.
And up in the lounge, we had this document. Buthelezi had it, he got it from Okumu, and he began looking over it, along with Jacob Zuma, who was there representing Mandela, Donnie Schutter, who was there representing de Klerk, and they sort of huddled like in a corner over this thing. And while South Africa was calling on the Lord to come and intervene, these minds were converging on this document until suddenly they say, I think we've got something. So Buthelezi says, call my plane up, tell them to come. Donnie Schutter phoned de Klerk and said, look, this is what we want to talk about. De Klerk said, jump on the plane and come right back. Here, now, I'm not quite sure what Zuma did. He may have gone through to Mandela, probably did. I was in my study there. I had preached that afternoon to that crowd and played my soul out, And I made a call for IFP to come back in to the elections at the same time. I made a call on the parties to find an accord, and I preached the gospel. I got back here and I was terribly depressed. I was in my study, just cast down. And suddenly a burden lifted, like a heavy blanket taken off me, lifted. And I had a sense of the Spirit of God saying to me, The stronghold has been broken and the walls have come down. You remember how Paul talks about the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds and bringing every thought captive to Christ. And I had a sense of the Lord say to me, that's what's happening now. Because I discovered later, round about the same time, about 9:15, 9 p.m., Mandela in Cape Town and Okumu were agreeing, let's go for this, and we go to Pretoria tomorrow, tie up the details. Buthelezi and the IFP Central Committee were saying, let's go for it. And de Klerk and Donnie Schutter were saying, we think we have something. This is all April 17th evening, and I'm in my study in there, and this is what's going through my soul. And the next day, the parties met in the union buildings under de Klerk's chairmanship. They dotted I's, crossed T's.
When the Israelites made it to the promised land and they got there, that same kind of feeling that you only get it once in your life.
After years of struggle, freedom was found. From this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The election commenced and was scheduled to take place over a 4-day period from 26 to 29 April 1994.
It was one of the most peaceful days in the history of this country. Everybody celebrated.
Because at long last we were doing something which as South Africans had been barred from doing, because the white minority had always held elections to which we were excluded. So there was a lot of excitement, and although it involved people standing on long queues for hours on end, it was something that people didn't complain about because of the excitement of seeing this dream coming true.
But now for the whole of South Africa, it was a new feeling. You knew that we are now talking real business. We're talking about governing the whole country. And that's what we've been fighting for all along.
I think the odds were very, very much stacked against us. And yet somehow we came through. And I don't believe that of the things that happened, that any single politician or any single person can take credit. Not that nobody deserves any human credit at all for anything, but can't take credit for the overall result and outcome.
You know, the journalists that were reporting on this from all over the country, they couldn't believe their eyes. They said, this is a miracle. Now, journalists don't normally use language like miracle. You know, they're very cynical people. They don't believe, they don't use religious language. But when they say it's a miracle, you just wonder, you know, it must be so big, even they can't miss it.
A miracle is a temporary suspension of the laws of nature. It's when something unnatural happens. So natural people cannot create a miracle. It has to take a supernatural person to create a miracle. So if you call 1994 a miracle, if it's a miracle, there must be a miracle worker. And a miracle worker cannot be a person defined by the laws of nature. It has to be somebody outside of the laws of nature, and it can only be God. But how does God work? God works through people. He makes those who are sworn enemies to become friends.
South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
Because there was this uniting person that said, guys, we are building something here, and help me get in there so that I can help you take you to the promised land. And the promised land is very close, but get me there. And the only way that we can do it is to go and exercise your right to vote. And I think that it's what got everybody excited and everybody inspired.
I stood in a queue and I cast my vote and I had to wait my turn. And we felt it was a great day. And there was optimism in the air and everybody was friendly. Friend and foe, they all were friendly. And we had a common purpose. We want to make this thing work.
And Donnie Scotter's car whooshed in. And he said, I had to come. He said, I know, because I was running this election. A miracle has happened.
And I went to see Michael at that stage just to thank him for the major role that he and his people had played to make this an inclusive election and therefore a peaceful election. Little did I know that that was not the end of the story.
Oh my gosh, Buthelezi may be pulling out of the election because there have been so many irregularities. So I got on the phone to Donnie and I said, Donnie, what's going on here? We need to do something. So he said, well, I'm going to come down by private military jet and I'll collect you in Maritzburg and we'll go out together to Ulundi.
That evening, we would be flying to Ulundi to try and save the election.
But in the meantime, we had to try to rectify the thing where all these papers weren't turning up and things were going wrong. And connection was made to Terry Rosenberg.
So I was sitting one day watching my son play rugby, and I got a call from Bobby Gottsel from Anglo American. I was on the board of AMEC at the time. And Bobby said that there was a little bit of chaos down in KZN and could I get the business community together. And the first person who came down was Judge Dinkaan Moseneke, for whom I have the greatest respect. And he said, we've got a slight problem, we've run out of forms. Now bear in mind they'd printed 80 million forms, 2 sets of 40 million because it was a national and a regional election, which was more than enough for the election, but somehow they'd run out and we needed 6 million forms to be done in double quick time. We then had to figure out how to get those forms to the remote areas, and the South African Air Force was fantastic. They set up an emergency base in Newcastle with Dakotas, with Alouette and Puma helicopters, and when the forms started coming off and being approved by the United Nations, so the Air Force was able to take those forms out to the remote areas. The next thing that the commissioners came down with was to say, well, unfortunately we've run out of invisible ink. So, I had no idea where to get ink from, but there was a lady working with me from one of the legal authorities, and she knew of a company in Richards Bay, which is quite far north of Durban, who made this ink. I don't know what they made it for, I don't know why they had it, but they had this invisible type ink, but they didn't have containers. And the plastic containers had to be very clearly specified, because if they went into the wrong container, you would lose the luminescence of the ink. We found that a director at Barlow's, whom I knew, had 4,000 of these 1 litre containers available. We got him out of dinner. He opened the warehouse. Sappi gave them a plane, and they were sending down the bottles, the containers, down to Durban. So now we had forms coming off the printing presses. We had ink coming from Richards Bay. We had bottles coming from Johannesburg. And then just as we were about to pack up for the evening, the commissioner came down again and said, a little bit embarrassed, but we've run out of ultraviolet lights. So we could have the ink, you could put your hand in the ink, but if you didn't have anything to put your hand under, it wouldn't show that you'd actually voted. So boy, we really now were at a loss. Bearing in mind that I had no experience in these areas at all. I was just the glue in the sandwich. I was basically just sitting there. And so we started to think big. The Concorde was still flying, and we thought maybe we could go to Hong Kong and get the Concorde and fly it in and get the ultraviolet lights. And anyway, I went up to the 19th floor. They were packing up, the monitoring people, all the United Nations people. And the lady from Jamaica said she had recently been in an election in Lesotho, and they'd used the same system, and they had about 600 to 700 lights. We had 500 extra polling booths. And she kindly gave me the phone number of the minister responsible. I phoned him at 1 a.m. in the morning. He graciously took the call. He realized the importance of it. He opened the airport at 7 o'clock in the morning. The South African Defence Force planes were flying around the airport. They landed. They didn't even get off the tarmac. The ultraviolet lights were put on board, and they were brought down to us to the emergency area in Newcastle, where from which they distributed the lights. So now printing forms from the printers, ink from Richards Bay, bottles from Johannesburg, ultraviolet lights from Lesotho, and basically the election got underway. What we did in days would normally have taken months to complete. And in this instance, there were just too many coincidences. They just were, for me, pure and simple God incidences.
South Africa woke up next morning, quite unaware of the dramas of the night, and the election was carrying on smoothly. Do you think God was in that? I think so.
A shift would happen when masses of people push for change. There would be a hope to shine a light on the injustices of the past, and that seismic shift had finally come.
We celebrate not the victory of a party, but a victory for all the people of South Africa.
Will you please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God"?
So help me God.
On the 10th of May, when President Mandela was inaugurated, I had a great sense of achievement because I realized when I became president in 1989 that I had one term to bring about the changes which the National Party has then already agreed upon within its own ranks in principle.
Mandela had become the country's president and not just the blacks' president.
I remember we used to shout, freedom in our lifetime. But when we were sleeping in bed, you wondered, in fact, whether that would happen. But it happened, because we didn't abandon hope.
There was always a feeling, in my heart anyway, that God somehow will pull us through.
This ushered in one of the greatest eras of African history. Under President Mandela, there was hope, peace, and progress. South Africa became a shining example of socio-political transition without full-scale civil war, even though the price of freedom had come at a very high cost. People who were sworn enemies became neighbors and friends. New opportunities and education opened up for millions who were previously disadvantaged. The new South Africa represented all its people and was called the Rainbow Nation. In an effort to prove this, it was announced that South Africa would now have 11 official languages.
The journey of life is never a straight line. And the same holds true for South Africa. After President Mandela's presidency, certain cracks started appearing in the Rainbow Nation. 26 years later, the Rainbow Nation finds itself in another major crisis.
You and your government don't represent me. You represent your own interests. And I'm warning you, I really am warning you, out of love. I am warning you like I warned the nationalists. You are disgraceful. I want to warn you. You are behaving in a way that is totally at variance with the things for which we stood.
Yes, there is a witness that God would like to see come out of our situation. We have not stewarded it well. We've made ourselves repulsive in the eyes of many who were looking to us with hope. We have given them the opposite.
I'm going to say that we're in a crisis, a very serious crisis. And I know this crisis is hitting very hard on young people who get educated. We encourage them to go to school, to get educated. They get degrees, no jobs.
Government corruption and high crime rates, a failed economy, and continued poverty have caused many South Africans to lose hope yet again.
There was a great breakthrough that this country needed at the time. But 25 years later, we can only say that it's an opportunity squandered.
And that is why we've arrived back at the same question that we asked before the fall of apartheid. Is there hope for South Africa, or will we make the same mistakes all over again?
I don't myself think that the opportunity has been totally squandered. It has been compromised. Aspects of it have been squandered. We've wasted a lot of time and energy with a lot of nonsense. But there's still enough there to get it back on track and to retrieve and to save that miracle.
The same God that gave us that miracle is still waiting for us to do exactly the same thing that we did, for him to really give us the second miracle of now really building us into a formidable nation.
I'm personally challenged by Michael's statement regarding being one of the 10 spies that didn't believe they could overcome the challenges that lay ahead. I want to be a Joshua or Caleb that believes, together with God's help, we can overcome the challenges in our country.
The ideal future for us has to do with us learning from our past. There's nothing we can create. The Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that is done has been done before.
It seems to me the real key is for people to keep talking and understanding. Someone said one time, nothing happens till people meet.
We have people today who run away from confronting and who run away from coming into a space where we must confront difference. They rather continue in their lagers and enclaves and stay in what is called echo chambers amongst those who validate and speak the same thing that they speak, and not go and encounter those who speak differently.
A lot of whites are Africans. I said to people, they're Africans. Most of them are born here. You know, they're not from the Netherlands or someplace else. So you are an African, you know, who's light-skinned than me, but you're an African. And I think there has to be that proper meeting of hearts, not heads. It's not a head thing, it's a heart thing.
Kom ons akkommodeer almal en so werk ons in die nasionale belang, veroorsaak ons 'n heeltemal 'n ander gesindheid wat die gevolg sal hê dat daar ekonomiese groei, stabiliteit en ontwikkeling sal wees, want dan is ons kollegas en vriende en dan is ons nie opponente nie.
So you have to minimize the difference, even though it's there, and maximize what is common. What's common for us is that we're first and foremost South African before we belong to our ethnic and tribal groups. So we need to have a common vision that we rally around, which defines us as South Africans, first and foremost.
We need to see our diversity not as a weakness or as a cause for battle, but as a cause for taking hands and working together and working for the best interest of all South Africans.
We are a diverse nation, and we are better off that way than the alternative. So this current generation has to learn to live with those who are different from them.
What is our 100-year plan? What is the master plan for this nation? 100 years from today, what kind of people do we want to become? And say, we will put everything and work in building this 100-year nation. We need to really design or create values for this country. So I believe that evil prevails when good men do nothing. And I think good men and good women are there. And I believe it's time that we hold hands and we do things. I think we can.
Do your bit. Everybody, do your bit. You may not be able to change the government. You may not be able to overthrow the economy or transform the economy. You may not be able to give everybody a job, but do your bit.
I know that we're in the deep end. But nevertheless, I would say that as someone old, as an elder, having gone through a very difficult time of oppression, we never abandoned hope. I still feel that as a believer, that God is on his throne, and that difficult as it is, I still appeal to them never to abandon hope, because God rules
And why, of all the nations in this continent, which nation has achieved what we did? None. There was no transition in the continent that happened peacefully. We did, because God showed up for us. But sadly, we forgot God. And I think God is very practical, by the way. God is not a philosophical God. You know, faith without works means nothing. So we must put our faith with our works. And He will hear again. And He will come down and our nation will be healed.
God did it then in prayer, and I honestly believe South Africa is going to be saved. And I believe in the bigger scheme of things, it's prayer which would have saved it.
Our national anthem, for example, Nkosi Sikelel, is a prayer. There's prayer crafted out of those people who were convinced there ought to be a better way.
If my people, who are called by my name,
will humble themselves and pray,
and turn away from their wicked ways,
I will hear from heaven, I'll come down.
Forgive the sin and heal the land.
There were many empty spaces in those queues for people who had given their all for the price of freedom. Voters could only be haunted by the memories of struggle and tragedy etched into the nation's memory. The atrocities happening in our nation today do not do justice to those people who paid the ultimate price. So let us learn from the past and remember that a country built on fear, self-preservation, and domination will only open the hole for darkness to prevail again.
Yes, South Africa still has serious challenges, but the miracle story of our democracy teaches us that God can use ordinary people to bring about great change. So together with African Enterprise, we invite you to do your bit and let us together build a new South Africa for all.
1994 was the biggest miracle that we have witnessed in this nation, when we saw the birth of a nation, a rainbow nation with hope for the future that rose from the ashes of the past. But it seems like that hope was fading away a few years after that. And then come the death of Brendan Horner, a farmer who was killed here. And we were seconds away from a civil war. And instead of the people taking up arms, they decided and chose to work together, and everyone doing their bits to build our town. And this is our heart, to leave a legacy for the young people that are also here with us, who are also joining to build this town and to make it a great town. Not only the town, but also our nation. So we are actually living our second miracle here in Senegal.
Nkosi sikeleli Afrika, malupakanyisu ponolwayo, izwa imithandazo yethu. Nkosi sikelela thina lusapho lwayo, murena buluka sitshaba sa Yesu, ufedise dintwali matswenye, o sibuluke, sitshaba sa Yesu, sitshaba sa South Africa, South Africa. Het blauw van onze hemel, uit de diepte van ons hart. Oor ons eeuwige gebed to come together, and united we shall stand. Let us live and strive for freedom in South Africa, our land.
Dear Father, we come to you this morning and we are so mindful of this important time for our country, where we are all focused on our future, Lord, that we as citizens may be faithful to do our part and to support our leaders. Lord, we pray for wisdom for our leaders, Lord. At such a time as this, we know that it can be so critical for our future, the future of our children, the future generations. So we ask, Lord, that we might really be part of the solution for our country and not part of the problem, that we might just stand together as one, and even as a church of TPC, Lord, that we might hold up the arms of our leaders of TPC as they lead us into the future. And the future of this country, Lord, we know is in your hands. So we just entrust this whole process to you, Lord, and we believe that you know the future, Lord. You know what lies ahead. So, Lord, we just are obedient to you today, and we entrust everything to you. Help us to cast our votes, Lord, faithfully. Help us to support in every way we can, to uplift people, to uplift our communities, and to build a strong nation together. Amen. Amen.
God bless South Africa, heal our broken land. God bless South Africa with your outstretched hand. We turn our eyes on you. We turn away from sin. We humbly call upon your name and ask you once again. God bless South Africa, heal our broken land. God bless South Africa with your outstretched hand. Your mercy when we fall, your strength in us to stand upon your grace, upon your truth. We ask you once again. God bless South Africa, heal our broken land. God bless South Africa with your outstretched hand. We're on our knees. We're on our knees to pray. Only our God can save. We're on our knees to pray. God bless South Africa, heal our broken land. God bless South Africa with your outstretched hand.
I'm taking up the offering right now. The local church is the hope of the world is a phrase that has been coined, and I think it's a good phrase. And we need our church to be strong so that we can shape minds, so that we can direct to the future, so that we can develop citizens, and so that we can be a voice in our community. And so as you are faithful in your giving, you are helping us in this task. You're not helping us, we're helping each other in this task because you're a part of us as well. God bless you as you give. The ways to give are on the screen.